Hello everybody. We're going to look right the way through some of the effects here in BCC version 8 in Premiere Pro. But primarily my interest is in providing you with the skills to understand, or if you like, the core mechanisms at work in these effects. You're going to see in a lot of the special effects we're working on, there's going to be some repeated controls. We've got things like a side-by-side comparison mode, for example, that allows us to compare and contrast the work that we're doing. So my interest as a trainer is always in focusing on these core standard controls because they allow you to go on and self-train. So I'm primarily going to be focusing this on serving new users, or I guess in all of these presentations, people that have used systems before, particularly people who have self-trained, often miss little details, so we'll try to fill in some blanks for you as well. The integration of the Boris effects into Premiere Pro is very, very simple. So I'm working here with Premiere Pro version 6. I've moved my interface around a little bit, but if we look in my effects panel, you can see just under video effects, I've got this whole series of BCC8 categories. I've got time effects, textures, image restoration we're going to spend a fair amount of time on today. And under lights here, we've got a fantastic 3D lens flare, which I'm probably going to use as my primary example for the demonstration of the controls, because it covers a lot and it's a pretty cool effect. So integration is pretty straightforward. And in fact, it's just one installer. If you're working with Premiere Pro and After Effects, install it once and you're going to find that these plugin effects will pop up in both of the applications. Now, if you're using After Effects already, you'll know that After Effects can think in 3D in a way that Premiere Pro can't. So some of the options just won't appear inside Premiere Pro because they're not relevant. For example, we're going to look also today at the particle system effect. And for example, just over here, I've created a silly example of a particle being generated. Now, what's great about this is that it's acting in true 3D. And if I begin to spin this around, you can begin to see what I mean. In fact, if I just take off the boundary on it here, let's get rid of this, and you can begin to see this being generated in 3D space. I hope you can make that out as I begin to adjust it. We're working in 3D even though we're in a 2D environment. Now, if you're working in After Effects with an effect like the Particle System Complete effect, you can even interact with these particles using a virtual camera, which is really cool. And we were talking about this before we started, that if you wanted to, you could generate a kind of particle effect bullet time from the Matrix, have everything freeze, and then spin the camera around the particles and just create that illusion of 3 dimensions. And the other thing to mention, I suppose, is if you're new to working with effects like this, compared to the effects that are integrated into Premiere Pro from the start, there seems like an awful lot of controls. If I go to, let's see now, just something like, well, if I was to go to just a simple color correction effect from Premiere Pro and maybe put on something like a luma curve, you might have used this before and you see it and you think, okay, I've got a control and I've got my output option to see the luma, and it's pretty simple for me to make adjustments to my clip. Fantastic. When you start to work with these more advanced effects, it can seem initially a little bit overwhelming as you scroll down and down and down and down and down and see these controls. And I guess I want to say before we begin, just get rid of that, really don't worry about it. It's a little bit like the TV show that I think is in most countries now, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. If you know the answer to the question, it's not stressful, you just know. And as we work through these controls, hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have the confidence to just scan down the list and find the options that you want. These are powerful professional effects, so they need to give you a lot of control. So we're going to work with this. Let's start out with the lens flare 3D. Let me just pick up a clip here. So I'm working in Premiere Pro. I've got multiple tabbed sequences here, and I've got a clip which, if I just open it up in the source monitor by double clicking, you can see it's just somebody sitting in front of a window and I want to create a lens flare effect around the join here. Now this is a really powerful lens flare effect, and I know for a lot of people lens flares are kind of, you know, do I really need it? And if I don't need it, I'm not going to use it. But there are a lot of different applications of this effect in your post-production. I'll show you what I mean. So first of all, one of the big differences, if I just pull this effect off, let's go into my effect controls. I'm just going to get rid of the effect first of all, and I'll just show you it on the list. So under the BCC8 lights category, I've got my lens flare 3D. And coincidentally, you've got a quick search at the top of the effects list in Premiere Pro. And this works with all the BCC effects. So if I just type in something like flare, I suppose, you can see I've got my BCC lens flare 3D. And I'm going to pull that onto the clip and apply it just like any other effect. And the first thing you'll notice is that a lens flare appears. So what I'm going to do, let me just adjust this over here, is start off by selecting the effect. And right away you can see that by selecting the effect on the list, as with other effects in Premiere Pro, I'm getting these control points. Now if I hover the mouse over, I hope you can read this okay on your screen. I'm getting a position XY, I'm getting another position XY, and I'm getting a tracking center. And I can move this position over, and as I move I'm getting a dynamic update showing me the results of this lens flare. I also have a pivot point, and you can see this pivot point is the point around which my lens flare is going to move. If I just pull this towards the edge, you can see I'm getting some fantastic, beautiful chroma aberration at the edge, and this is updating very, very quickly, and it's rotating around that pivot point. Now I mentioned that these effects have a lot of controls, and this is no exception. What's beautiful about this effect is that it allows you to pretty much turn on and off anything you want in your lens flare. There's a ton of different controls, different lines and textures and orbs. There's also a beat reactor, which I'll show you in just a moment. So we've got this long list of controls, and obviously if you're working with a new effect, it can be a little bit confusing and a little bit difficult to know where to begin. So you'll notice in a lot, if not all of the BCC effects, we have this very, very simple control. We've got help and register, and there's the name of the preset that we're working on. And I've got an up and down arrow here to work through multiple presets that come installed with the BCC plugin. I've also got a load and a save. So if I click on load, this is going to browse on my hard drive directly to my presets. And you can see the path. This is just on my C drive. I'm on Windows here. On Mac OS, it would show you the Finder, of course. And you can see I've got various different effects. And let's say I'm just going to go for a simple one. Let's go for a lens star. I'll open that up. This is pretty much where I was before. And if I click on the heading for the effect, I can now go in and reposition this. And just what I want is to have this around about the join of the window here. As the lens moves in the real camera, the real world camera, I want to just follow the corner of the window and create this lovely flaring across the scene. And there's a couple of different ways that I can approach that. Now, before I get into modifying the settings in too much detail, I should also mention, for those of you that are not familiar with Adobe applications like Premiere Pro and After Effects, there's a very, very simple mechanism for keyframing. You'll notice next to each of the controls in my Effect Controls panel here, I've got a little stopwatch. And if I turn that stopwatch on, then I'm going to create a keyframe. And this little mini timeline represents the duration of the clip on my main sequence timeline. And that keyframe is going to store the settings for just that control at that moment in time. Once I've turned on keyframing, I can make changes at any time. I'm just going to click and drag here to increase the global intensity, which is going to make the this lens flare overall a bit brighter. Oh, it's a little bit too much. But maybe if we stick with that, you'll see what I mean. A keyframe's been added, and now if I just drag back and start to scrub through, now as I say, I'm sharing this display with the 3D controls on the graphics card and I'm distributing this across the net. So my machine's not as responsive as it might be otherwise, but effectively I've created a flare that is burning out the screen. So there we've got our nuclear explosion effect. Very, very simply created with 2 keyframes. Now, when people are new to using keyframes, they tend to get very carried away. I've got this option here to add or remove a keyframe, go to the previous one, go to the next one. A lot of people get keyframe happy. They really get carried away adding these keyframes. And then the problem is when you make changes to one part of your effect, it just doesn't update because you've locked it down. And my advice is to use the minimum number of keyframes that you possibly can. So in fact, I'm going to turn off keyframing for this part of the effect. And what I'm controlling here, let me just get that and say OK. What I'm controlling here is the overall intensity, irrespective of any other controls I've applied in this effect. I've also got an overall scale for my lens flare that I can adjust as well. Now, I just want to draw your attention especially to the global intensity, because later on I'm going to use the beat reactor, which is a feature that allows the effect to interact with audio to amplify the effect on the fly, which is pretty cool, and it's going to use the global intensity to do it. I've also got this scale by distance option, and the scale by distance option is really most useful in After Effects, where this filter can use virtual lights that you've created in After Effects as the light source. Now, if I let me just scroll down the camera options here. Again, if you're working in After Effects, BCC can use your virtual camera as the camera used for the lens flare. So effectively, it synchronizes perfectly with the movements of your virtual camera. But here, I've got the option to generate a camera. Remember, we're working in 3D in a 2D application, and I can specify whether my camera is going to give me position controls or just pan controls around the shot, or my favorite is probably orbit, which locks the point of interest for the camera on the pivot point and uses that to reposition the angle. Otherwise, if I leave this on position, you see I've got tumble and spin and rotate. This is my X, Y, and Z adjustments for my camera position, not for the lens flare, but for the camera position. And I am in danger if I set this off too much. I can just lose the lens flare altogether. It's just going to disappear off screen. So let me just undo that. And let me go back to putting this in orbit mode. You see a lot of these controls disappear. And now, if I scroll down a little bit, I've got my orbit, radius, and tumble and spin, and I can still make adjustments. I think we've lost some of our flare effect. Oh, there we go. It's still there. I can still make adjustments, but I'm locking onto the flare. So as I scroll down, you see I've got my global intensity control. I've got my scale. I've also got my source radius that controls the scale of the lens flare effect itself. I'm getting pretty slow responses here while I'm streaming to the web. I've also got diffraction control, which is diffracting the image of the video. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I've got a ton of other stuff to show you. But what I want to illustrate really is, let's just take, for example, this intensity scale. If I begin to adjust this, you can see very quickly what the result of that control is. And I'm just clicking and dragging here. Anywhere in an Adobe application that you see orange numbers with an orange underline, then you can click and drag, or you can click and type and punch in a number. Now, if I drag in one direction, I see one extreme of the adjustment. If I drag in the other, I can see the other extreme. And so effectively, now I've got no lens flare at all. If I set this to 0, and I can use this to create a lens flare that appears out of nowhere. So just by clicking and dragging on these controls, let's set this back to 100. Just by clicking and dragging on these, you can find out what the control does. All you have to do is click on it and have a look at the result. Now, what I really want to do is scroll down a little bit here to my light source controls. You can see I've got the option to base my light source on an image, a light that's generated inside the effect. But I can also create a light that's based on the luminance of my reference layer. So you'll notice, if I just set this back to built-in, all these controls are grayed out. So right now I'm generating a built-in light. I've got an X and Y position for it. And if I scroll up and select the effect heading, you can see now, if I can just move this over. So there you go. There's my light source. And by choosing built-in as my light source type, I can now just click and drag to show where I want my lens flare to come from. I'm going to set this up in the corner of the window because in a moment I'm going to have this motion track. It's going to give me this nice refraction in the virtual lens. But another thing I want to do is have this position come out from behind the girl in the picture. I want to use her as an obscuration layer, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. So again, I've got built-in. I can use the luminance of a source layer. If I do that, the built-in options are grayed out, and now under my luminance controls, in a moment it's going to update, and I've got my video layer as a source, and I can use that. You can see it's a little bit too bright. I need to adjust the threshold here, and let me get rid of my color and size adjustment. And by specifying a threshold, I'm telling Premiere Pro, or I'm telling the effect, at what point I want something to be bright enough to generate a lens flare. And that's just fantastic. So here with a threshold set at 88, I'm getting an awful lot. Let's set this to 75. You can see, of course, this is procedurally generated, so even the black edges from my unfortunate pillar boxing is getting the effect as well. But now I'm procedurally generating lens flares based on my brightness. If you've got assets with highlights, this is going to give you very natural looking lens flares. And we've got a flicker control, pretty straightforward. If you want it to have some shimmer and flicker, you can add that. But what I really want to show you is further down the list. You can see I've got a flare control here. And let's just pull this back over. I can adjust the color of the flare. If I turn this off and on, you should be able to see the result here on this massive lens flare. I'm getting this colored, I don't know what you call it, like a bowl of light. Now these effects are all operating in 32-bit. In fact, all of the effects are 32-bit, except if I look on the list, there's just one category that's not yet 32-bit, which is this 3D objects category, where you can extrude shapes and put text in. That category is operating in 8-bit, but everything else is operating in 32-bit. You can really see this on high-resolution media. You can really get a sense of the curve on these. And if I look down the list, I've just got a ton of different options I can turn off and on. I've got stripes, rings, glows, chroma hoops. I'm turning these off so you can see the result. Caustic effects, a star caustic. All of these are things that you can turn off and on, and all of them are things that you can keyframe. So you've got an enormous amount of control. But what I want to do is I just want to show you as an example, using this girl as her own obscuration layer. So if we look, let me bring up let me get rid of that flare control. And I've got a mix with original option, so I don't have to have this blended in completely. I can have a degree of influence from the effect. You can keyframe that as well. I'll show you the beat reactor in just a moment. Now I'm going to choose a standard lens flare. I'm just going to take a simple one that like I chose before, the lens star. Okay, and if I just scroll down a little bit, I'm going to choose my obscuration type. Now, what this is going to do is use a different layer as a reference to hide the lens flare. So first of all, let me pull this up, onto another layer. And in order to get the effect I want, I'm not going to use the RGB levels or the alpha of the clip below because, well, there isn't a clip below at the moment, but if I had one there, it doesn't have any alpha. I could use this title, which has alpha. I'll come to that in a moment. But in fact, what I really want to do is generate some alpha. So I've created a separate sequence, which is right here. And this is a sequence that just has a very, very simple garbage matte on it. So I've created alpha on that sequence. You can use anything you like. You could paint, you could use Photoshop. I'm going to take that, let me go over to my, here we go, to my lens flare, and I'm going to put that under this clip. And then in my effect controls, I'm going to just go into my obscuration map layer option, and I'm going to say use video 1. So I've put this video clip up on video 2, and I'm going to use this layer underneath as a reference. Now there are multiple ways of doing this, but by using this as a reference and specifying that I want to use the alpha, I'm saying that, if I just turn this layer off for a second by clicking on the eyeball, I'm saying anywhere where I can see this layer, I don't want to see the lens flare. Anywhere where I can't see it, I do want to see the lens flare. So if I now go back to my position, and let me just select this, and I've got my position control. As I pull this out from behind the girl, you can see I'm starting to see my lens flare. So now that I've set this up, I can use this as a procedurally generated effect. All I have to do is make sure I have the correct control, which is going to be under my light source. I'm going to turn on keyframing at the beginning of the clip, so I'm moving my playhead to the start of the clip, turning on the position control. I'm going to go to the end or towards the end of the clip with my playhead. This playhead represents the playhead on the timeline. And I'm going to pull this position control out. And the result is, if I render this, it's going to generate a motion path between the two keyframes where hopefully, if I just drop the resolution on this a bit, you can see. Let's pull this down. At the bottom of the program monitor in Premiere Pro, we have a resolution control that just speeds up the generation of these kinds of effects. And you can see as I drag the playhead through, this is generating the movement and the lens flare is being revealed behind the subject in this video clip. It's fantastic. And in fact, there is another version of this I'd like to show you as well before I move on from the lens flare effect. If I go back to my lens flare and just scroll over, there's a fantastic option for you to set the obscuration to follow the edge of an object. So here, if I just, actually let me, no, that's not the obscuration, it is, where's my, my light source? Here we go. If I choose under light source, I should say, the edge map, I can now specify under my light source settings that I'm going to use my video 1 layer to specify the origin of my lens flare. And this is a classic way for you to generate motion that tracks around an object. Now, in this case, I'm using my video 1 layer, which is this title, and I've put the lens flare onto it. And I'm specifying what constitutes an edge. So I can say, for example, here it's really simple. I've got a big T for title, and I've got white pixels and dark pixels or transparent pixels. And so it's very easy for the tracker to identify the edge. But the really cool part of this is when you begin to keyframe it. If, for example, I turn on keyframing for the position control, you can see as I click and drag on this, hopefully this is going to update for me. This is tracking around the object. So if I want to have this animate, let me set this back to 0. And then let me jump on a little bit in the effect. And maybe I'll set this to 360 because it's 360 degrees. And now, as I drag through, you can see my lens flare is following the edge of my title, although it's probably a little bit slow coming up on your screen. If I go to my pre-rendered version of the same effect, so you can see this a little bit better, I've got the same effect with a much more subtle lens flare. And I can probably play this and you'll be able to see it, hopefully not too bad in the playback. You can see that working. Now there is another control for the lens flare, which is the beat reactor. And I want to show you the beat reactor in this effect because it's, again, it's an effect that appears, it's a control that appears in multiple effects. So just briefly, I've got a lens flare set here, which is just a simple lens flare effect. It's just a glow on the screen. And if you look down at the very bottom of the controls, we've got this beat reactor section. Now, everything I'm showing you here is cumulative. All of these controls you can add and combine to create the effect you want. I'm using a very simple example with basic lens flare, but you can adjust this to create streaks of light, rings of light, and all of those options you have to define the appearance of the lens flare you can use in this way. So here, under my beat reactor, and again this appears in multiple effects, I can load a preset if I want, but essentially the workflow is very, very simple. Let me, I'll just stick with this one because I don't want to go back too far to the beginning because there's a lot I want to show you. First of all, you need to apply your lens flare and create the lens flare effect that you want. I've just done this on transparent video. And this is a really nice thing because in Premiere Pro, you can't really use transparent video for much. You make a transparent video layer in the bin by clicking on the new item button and choosing transparent video. And historically, you could only really use that for the timecode effect in Premiere Pro. In fact, you can put that effect onto one of the new adjustment layers in Premiere Pro as well now. So you don't really need transparent video at all. But now with the Boris Continuum Complete plugin set, you have a use for it. Make a transparent video layer. It has the same controls as making a title, and then you add it to your timeline like any other clip, just like a title. In this case, I've put the lens flare effect on, and I've scrolled down to the beat reactor controls. And all I have to do is load up an audio clip. See, I've got one here. If I look in my demo assets, under music. Now, it does need to be an AIF file. AIF files are just, if you like, Apple-style uncompressed audio files. If you've got a WAV file, you can easily convert that into an AIF very, very quickly. It really just needs rewrapping. I did mine in Adobe Audition. I just opened up the file and did save as and saved it as an AIF. And it was almost instant because it's just rewrapping it. It's almost doing little more than changing the file extension. Once you've browsed to that file, then let me turn on the display of my graph. Let me turn off the audio here. Once you've assigned an audio file, this beat reactor is going to show you, if you like, it's a histogram of the frequencies. So I've got low frequencies on the left, high frequencies on the right. And this lighter box is my selected region because you don't necessarily want to use all of the frequencies and all of the amplitude to apply this control. And what the control is going to do is as the frequencies enter the box and you specify the location of that box in these parameter controls. So you can see I've got, where are we now? My parameter A, parameter B, and C. Here I've got my corners. So if I click and drag this, you can see it's adjusting that box in the middle. Any audio that enters that box becomes the scale for my effect. In this case, the effect is going to be to adjust the global intensity for my lens flare. Now, if you remember, right back at the beginning, I showed you that global intensity control. So by specifying which frequencies, and also I have a scale of the effect, I've got a strength control here that adjusts the intensity, I'm now able to use my audio to define the global intensity for the effect. Now, I'm conscious that as I'm showing you this, I'm skipping over an awful lot of controls. Most of these, you will work out what they do just by clicking and dragging and pressing play. I really just want to draw your attention to the ones that will guide you through using the effect. And again, here, notice that I've got, if I just collapse this a little bit, I've got an apply parameter A, apply parameter B, apply parameter C option. B and C I'm not using. I could use these to define, for example, the X position and the Y position of my lens flare. So you can have the lens flare move across the screen based on the beat of your music or the intensity of different frequencies of your music. In this case, if I turn off my show graph option, and I'm just going to, you see I've got an only in draft mode, that's really particularly relevant to After Effects. If I turn that off, you can see now, if I just scrub through this, now this might not be very responsive on my machine because I haven't rendered it, but as I scrub through, you can see my lens flare changing in intensity. And it's doing that in response to the music. I'd have to render to show you that back with the music. Now, the way I've configured the effect, there is no music. I've had to edit this clip into the timeline independently of the controls for the effect. So just for the record, the effect is not using the audio on the timeline. You're using the audio file that you browse to from inside of the effect. Okay, I think that's enough on the lens flare. So let me show you some of the other effects. And again, the controls I'm showing you, you'll find appear in multiple effects within the BCC suite. First of all, stage light. just very briefly, stage lights, if I go into my lights category of effects, we've got lots of different kinds of lights. The stage light is important because it can generate volumetric lights. And you can see here, I'm creating a simple lighting effect. Again, this is fantastic in After Effects because it's 3D. And if I just, actually, I'm going to need to apply this to transparent video. Let me take that effect off because, of course, I'm applying it to a layer and replacing the contents. So let me go back and get my transparent video, put that on top of my clip. Again, with graphics or titles, you can trim them to any duration you like in Premiere Pro. I'm going to go to my stage light, put it on that transparent video, and you can see there it is appearing on my clip. And it's a very simple effect to set up. I'm going to select the effect heading in my effect controls panel. That's going to give me my position and my point of interest. If I pull this up to the corner of the screen, by the way, this shot, I should explain, the shot I was using there for lens, the lens flare, is a little short film that I shot about a girl with the power of telekinesis. And I'll show you, hopefully I'll have time to show you the wire removal filter that we have as well. In this case, it's a shot for a micro short for my feature film project that I'm working on at the moment. And this is a series of little films that we're going to release in the lead up to the film. And so we have this guy sitting on a bench, and a moment later he pulls out a gun and puts it away again. So here I can use the built-in camera controls exactly the same as the lens flare effect. I can also specify if I'm going to have smoke. Now, I'm not going to turn this on my machine because I've noticed earlier when combining this with the web streaming, it's tending to make my machine run really, really slowly because it's doubling up the functionality of the graphics card. So I won't turn that on, but it creates smoke particle effects in the light beam. And I've also got an overall intensity. And you can see here, if I just select the effect again, I can specify the point of interest for that light, pull this down and reposition the light, and just create the sense of volumetric light coming in from behind the subject in this shot. You can do this with a lot of different effects. You can fake this with garbage mats and softening, but this effect gives you a very, very natural looking fall off. It's if you like, a real 3D virtual light source. And you'll notice that we have up to 3 available in this effect. Again, if I just scrub through here, it just gives you a very, very natural looking light. Now, moving on quickly, because I can see the time is going incredibly fast. If I go to my particle system sequence here, let me just toggle over. You'll notice there my system is running a bit slow now because I'm triggering the CUDA support and the 3D processing in my graphics card by using that stage light effect. But hopefully we can switch. Here we go. I'll just save. Sometimes when I'm working with complex sets of hardware and software, my fingers hover over Control S or Command S. Now, in this shot, I've got a photo that I took in, I think I took this in Spain actually, and the original is just a photo. I thought I'd use this as a background. And I want to show you, if I just collapse this category, we have a whole particles collection of effects inside BCC 8. And I want to show you this particle system. Now, this is an enormous effect, and I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on it because I have a bunch of other effects to skim through, including some very, very cool ones. But I just want to show you a couple of things about this. Here's my effect, particle system, and notice if I click on this, I can choose the center point for it. At the moment, I'm saying to composite with layer none, which means I'm just replacing my video, or in this case, my still, with the effect. But if I click on this composite with layer menu, I can specify, no, I do want you to composite this with my video 1. Now again, I'm using a photo, but you could use anything. And you'll notice, I'm just going to expand out these controls. Let me scroll down a bit. Let me just toggle down these disclosure triangles, as they're called. And check out the amount of control that you have over this particle system. It's absolutely fantastic. Notice that we've got a motion tracker. I don't need to show you that because it's exactly the same motion tracker as we have in the lens flare. Notice that we've also got, what I really want to show you, lots of animation controls. We've got gravity. You can see if I scrub through here, you can see the particle effect at work. But what I really want to show you, if I just scroll up a little, see I've expanded too much now. Here we go. Under the production area, let me start right at the top. We've got a particle shape. We can choose blurs. Let me choose something like, how about wide sparkles? Okay, so I'm creating sparkles. And you'll notice that the colors of this particle effect are coming from the original media. They're automatically being based on a procedurally generated randomization of the colors that appear in the original media. You can see I've got some of the highlights there. I've got some of the dark tones. This is being generated based on my media. You can see also I've got, let me scroll down. Here we go, under reference. Let me set this to none, so I'm not going to see that blue line. And there's my particles. Now I've got control over the birth rate, the lifespan of these particles. Each particle has a life of its own. But I just want to show you here, look at this spin control. If I click and drag, let me pull forward a little bit. This is fantastic. Let me set this to full res. If I click and drag on the spin control, you can see these particles moving in three-dimensional space. This is a 3D effect applied inside a 2D application. If I pull down the spread a little bit to reduce the size of the effect, you can see now as I spin this around, I'm actually generating these particles in 3D. And in fact, while I'm doing this, I can also introduce physics. So maybe I'll turn up the gravity a little bit, and as I scrub through, you can see these are appearing and cascading down to the bottom of the screen. Now, probably more than any other effect, you can learn how this filter works, how this effect works, by clicking and dragging and playing with it. This is absolutely an effect where you're going to want to sit down with a packet of cookies and a pot of coffee and experiment. But again, just to draw your attention to a couple of the key controls. Notice here under the appearance category of controls, I've got my compositing options, normal. These are actually standard Photoshop style blend modes. So I can choose different blend modes for my effect and get multiple different results. This creates, if you like, a mathematical result of combining the foreground pixels with the background pixels. In this case, my foreground is the particles I'm generating, and my background is my still image. Of course, the still image isn't moving. But notice here, I've got start color using. I've also got midpoint color use and end color use. Now, I mentioned just now that each particle has a lifespan, which we can specify. We've got opacity controls as well. But under my color, at the moment, I've got random source. I've got a secondary random source, which just chooses different colors. I've got a range of different options. But if I choose custom color, I can click on this color swatch and I can specify, maybe if it'll let me. Is my machine going to let me? Yes, there we go. I can specify maybe green as my starting color. And as the pixels, let's go to my midpoint color. Let's choose a different custom color. Let's choose red. Now, again, you'll notice that my interface, a little bit as the problem I had before with the motion tracker, partly because I am streaming my interface at the same time as using it, I'm getting some delay with the update. There we go, it's gone live. And now if I choose another color, there we go. I'm now creating a pretty awful looking animated particle effect. But you can work your way through these and specify wind effects. You can translate. You can also specify attractors. So if you turn on using attractors, you can specify areas in the picture that these particles are drawn towards. So they really exist in a three-dimensional world. And my goodness, is that the time already? Let me show you very, very quickly, because there's some important effects as well. I have a whole range of effects for correcting images. Let me start off with the optical image stabilizer. Here is a clip that isn't too wobbly, but it's pretty bad. If I just play this, you can see it's all right, but that was me attempting to settle using my tripod as a Steadicam. You can do it, but it does give you a sore shoulder. So if I now go to, let me go to my image stabilizer. Let's just type in here. Now you do have a warp stabilizer in Premiere Pro as well, but while the warp stabilizer gives fantastic results most of the time, if you do have, if you like, very muddy footage, it can sometimes give you some very strange aberration in the shot. It's one of those things. Sometimes you get lucky with it, sometimes you don't. So this is another stabilizer that you have in your armory. You can see the message on screen. It's saying, please click the Analyze button to continue. So I'm going to do just that. I've applied the effect. I'm going to click to Analyze, and Premiere Pro is going to very, very quickly look at the movement of my media. And right away you can see I've got a ridiculous amount of stabilization. I've got one eye and a mouth, and I've really lost a lot of the shot. And that's because if I turn this effect off, which I can obviously do by clicking up in my Effect Controls panel, you can see there really is a lot of movement in this shot. So the system has to scale a lot to maintain stability. If I switch this back on and change my mode to smooth, now this gets a lot more interesting. In smooth mode, hopefully I can play this and you can see, it just gives me a much smoother camera movement, and it kind of looks like I meant it. Now I'm going to render this, just pressing the Enter key on my machine here to give us a smooth playback, and hopefully you can see the results. Compare and contrast that, that's with the effect. Fantastic. Compare that to having this off. And you can see one looks like I meant it, and one looks like I didn't. So without really going into any of the controls here, and there are a lot of other controls, we can specify what's going to happen with edges. This is particularly good if you're working with graphic media inside the shot. We've got post-processing. We can put in the scaling. If I turn off the scaling, for example, you can see if I turn this into my stabilize mode and put the effect back on, you can see with the scaling turned off exactly what's happening. Not that useful, but at least it lets me see what's happening to the shot. A lot of controls, but you really don't need most of them. Apply the effect, click the button, and set it to smooth, and you're probably going to get a really nice result. Now, again, very, 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 very quickly, just to move on to my image restoration. I've got a ton of image restoration effects to show you. If I look down here in my image restoration category, I've got a DV fixer. Let me just run through these super fast. The DV fixer, if I set this up to about 200%, this is SD media. Maybe if I go for 400%. The problem with DV is you get a lot of aliasing. You get a lot of jagged edges on your media. Now this originally was shot on an HDV camera, so it's 1440 by 1080 resolution. But if I just demonstrate with this, it'll probably do. I'm going to put my, it's been downsampled to SD anyway, put my DV fixer effect on, and essentially what this is going to do is soften the edges. If I turn this effect up, hopefully you can see, if I adjust my threshold, let me just, this is going to be pretty intensive as an effect. And hopefully you can see the result. If I turn this off and on, it's pretty subtle on this shot. You can see on some of the pixels here, there isn't that much of a jagged edge because this wasn't originally shot in DV. If I turn my threshold down and let's just set this, soften up, maybe increase the iterations, you should be able to see, I don't know if it's going to update very well on your screen, there you can see some softening applied. This is effectively going to do anti-aliasing to my video. Now if I zoom out, you're going to see the result is, if you set this too high, it's going to give you some softening. But this does intelligently detect the edges of your media in order to get rid of those jagged edges that you can sometimes have on DV. It's particularly useful if you're scaling up. If you're scaling up your media, it's wonderful. Again, moving on, we've got a dust and scratches remover. Put it on, adjust the settings, experiment with them. It's going to get rid of dust in your shots. It, again, intelligently identifies spots of dust and removes them. But probably the main one I want to get onto is this flicker fixer. Here is a shot with some flicker. This is a beautiful, absolutely beautiful stop motion shot of some clouds. If I play through this, you can see there's some dimming and adjustment to the exposure simply because clouds are moving across the sun. Let me resize this a bit so you can see it a little more clearly. If I throw on the flicker fixer gives me a range of options to adjust and compensate for flicker in the shot. You'll notice that I've got a time window, and the time window is how many frames the effect is going to look at to average out the brightness of the pixels, if you like. Again, I've got a few different controls. I can specify where I'm going to sample. I can specify how much smoothing I want, and I can specify whether I want to do a frame analysis, which looks at the overall image, or if I want to look at the color information, because you could have color aberration because of a problem with your camera, or if I want to use YCC, which in this instance stands for the luminance, the Y, and then the chroma and the chroma, the blue and the green color information, or the UV color information if you're using UV color. So, which isn't exactly the same as blue and red, but it's another story. If we were to be looking just at luma flicker in our video, we can set this to YCC and we might get better results. But again, this is an effect where you don't really need to know all of the controls. And I'm a great believer in workflows that don't require you to think too much. All I need to do is set this to frame analysis and let it apply its effects. Now, I'm just going to, how long is that? 20 seconds. Let's see how long it's going to take to render this. I know I'm out of time, but I really want to show you the results. Tell you what, let me just trim this back and we'll apply it to a shorter section of the clip. I'm just pressing the / key there with the clip selected to mark in and out marks on the timeline. And I've got so many wonderful filters to show you, and I know we're out of time, but I do want to show you just a couple more before we quit and do maybe a little bit of Q&A. Okay, so now you can see the results of that flicker fixer. It really just fixes the flicker. It's gone. And it's an intelligent flicker removal filter you can just apply and sit back and have it fix the problem. And let me see, what have I got to show you that's really cool? Perhaps if I just show you one more, because it's beautiful to work with. We have a motion key. Now, I've seen a lot of examples of motion keys historically. I've never seen one that works quite as beautifully and easily as this. So here's a clip, and let's say I want to remove this car from the shot. Now, you might have seen 28 Days Later. This is an effect that was used in that film. I want to remove that car, and it's very, very easy to do using the motion key. What the filter is going to do is identify pixels that have changed and remove them and replace them with other pixels from within the shot. So I'm going to apply my effect. It's really simple to set up. I'm going to select the motion key heading. I'm going to start with my playhead at the start of the clip, and I'm just going to target this car. Now, I'm also going to turn on keyframing for the scale and the position, because I want to move this. Notice I do have a motion tracker, but I'm going to be lazy. The car's moving in a pretty simple line. I'm not going to bother using the motion tracker. I'm just going to move to the end of the clip. And now, because my keyframing is on, when I drag this point of interest down, I'm creating a motion path. You can see the motion path appearing. And if I just click and drag to reduce the scale, not that much. In fact, let me set the scale up here at the beginning, maybe that size. Let me jump to the first keyframe and scale down. Not too much. There we go. So now I've got an area selected that I want to remove from the shot. You can see that scaling and moving on the motion path. Again, you can use the motion tracker if you want. If you set up the motion tracker, then you've got apply and you can choose what the area offset is. So it's pretty easy to use. But in this case, all I have to do is set my mode to remove area, the default mode, and my car disappears. And as I scrub through, you can see, now I need to adjust my region a little bit. I haven't caught the edge of it, but as I scrub through, no car. Maybe I just need to set that start region to be a little bit bigger. Let's go for 0.5. Let's try that. Better. So now I've lost the car from the shot. It really is as simple as that. Apply the effect, choose where you want to remove by positioning, let me turn this back on, position your point of interest, and then hit go. And all of these other controls you can play with and experiment with, but you don't need to. You can just choose the area. Now, one last thing to say before I wind up. There are more filters I'd love to show you, but I know I'm out of time. But you'll notice that on this, the top of each effect, you've got load and save, so you can save your presets. There's also a help button, and the help in BCC is absolutely brilliant. If I click this button, it's just going to fire up Acrobat and it's going to give me exactly the user guide information I need for this effect. So if you're working with BCC and there's a particular effect, you can just jump in and look at the information about that one effect and learn about it as you go. And I encourage you to just, every time you sit down with Premiere Pro, you can try one new effect from Boris Continuum Complete, and because there's repetition in the controls, you'll discover that very quickly you're mastering the whole suite. Okay, I think I'd better wind it up there because I am a little bit over time. Thanks for coming along, everyone.